what the scriptures teach about this whole matter of what it means to go through adversity, tough times, tribulation, and turmoil. And it's very helpful for us to see the biblical exemplars, both from the Old and from the New Testaments. We've observed the story of people who have gone through trials, and those trials and burdens were miraculously alleviated, and they trusted God through the changed circumstances. Then there are others, though, for whom those circumstances did not change. And we see, again in both cases, that our call is to trust God regardless of the outcome, recognizing that the outcome, the fullness of it, is not going to be on this earth. And it's very, very important for us to remember then that we have no promise in this world that our afflictions, our tribulations, our illnesses, our losses will be made up to us in this life. No promise. And that's why again and again we hear about people who somehow claimed that God was going to do a particular thing, and then they become embittered against Him when that does not come to pass. Because what happened was they made the blunder of putting their hope in something God never really promised in Scripture. Yes, we have examples of great deliverances. And yes, God is in the miracle business, that He does heal people. We see this over and over again. And yes, He invites us to pray for people. But at the end of the day, He has a wisdom and an understanding that we do not grasp. And there will be times when He will invite a person to go through the circumstance that does not change, but they are delivered out of it, and ultimately into the arms of Jesus Himself. Ultimately, we're all terminal. We're all in this condition of frailty and mortality. It's just a question of how long that will be. And the biblical perspective, your life is like what? What does James say? He uses a metaphor about your life. Like a vapor. Yeah, and the imagery of the flower of the field also is used earlier in James. Like a flower of the field, he flourishes, and then all of a sudden its place is remembered no longer. An image that comes also from the Psalms, particularly Psalm 90, with Moses' meditation on the brevity of this earthly sojourn. We do well to remember that our hearts are not really meant to be fully here, but our hearts are to be at home. That is to say, we are to engage in and develop a homesickness, a longing for something that this world will never sustain. This fallen world, really cannot satisfy the deep longings of your heart. And we have to recognize that. So when we embrace a biblical perspective, it's being realistic, first of all, how short life is, and number two, it is hopeful. Why hopeful? Because we recognize that this time is brief, but that time will endure. And so it's a point of view that we need to sustain. We were talking about Job, for example, as one of those biblical illustrations. And we saw how his friends ultimately were giving him the kind of silly, superficial, shallow answers that we often hear even today, simplistic notions that if you have a problem, if you had more faith, you wouldn't have this situation. If you were a better man, if you did this or if you did that. You see, you brought this upon yourself. Life isn't that simple. It turns out, especially when we read the New Testament, that there is no promise in the New Covenant that our righteousness will lead to greater physical well-being. Nor is there any promise in the New Testament that unrighteousness will lead to physical loss. It turns out that there is an ambiguity here. All things being equal, of course our lives in this world are going to be better when we pursue the things we were meant to pursue. But at the same time, we do not want to suppose that we can control those outcomes. And we want to hold the life that we have been given very briefly with a loose grip. A loose enough grip so that God can fill the content of our lives and we can recognize that all things come from Him, through Him, and to Him, but that ultimately we go back to Him and we're being prepared in this soul-forming world for that very journey. So having that biblical perspective of the temporal versus the eternal is critical. A long while ago, I did a series of 15 sessions on the temporal versus the eternal here. I don't know if it goes back in the archives or not, but by the way, I think you all know that these are all being made available on my website, and they're archived back a few years now, so you can see any of the series that we've done since we started doing that. We do the same, by the way, with my Sunday morning class as well now, so that way if a person misses one, you can see that. But in that lengthy series, I discussed this whole theme that I believe is the major motif in Jesus' teachings. It's often been said that Jesus spoke more about money than about anything else, about wealth. Actually, he used the imagery of wealth to speak about the theme of the temporal versus the eternal. It's not the money is at issue, but it's what is actually at the center of our hearts. And so he used wealth as an illustration of the temporal versus the eternal. And I think arguably one can argue that that is, in fact, the primary theme that we see in his teaching in terms of having an orientation that treasures the things that God declares to be important, and to treasure those things that are temporal, and to understand, hold them with a loose grip. Enjoy them if you've been given to them, but those things do not define you. At the same time, treasure the things that are unseen, and understand that those things will endure. And so there's a wisdom in understanding this. And I believe that Job was given this interesting conclusion. The book of Job gives us this conclusion. It's bookended with insights that we can see. Most of the book deals with his suffering and his wrestling. And we discovered that when God finally appears to him in the whirlwind, he reveals that Job's problem was a lesser view of the greatness of God than he should have had. And that the problem wasn't suffering, it was a low view of the sovereignty and the sovereign purposes of the living God. And so that he had a lower view of God than he should have had. And when he goes through this process then, and he acknowledges, I spoke of things that are too deep and too wonderful for me to grasp. Things that I could not really understand. And he repents in sackcloth and dust and ashes. And effectively he says that I was trying to bring you into the dock and to judge you and to use my own understanding about life to say that you couldn't do this because this makes no sense to me. And when we realize that ultimately it's God who is the judge, and it's we who ultimately must be accountable for what he says, there is this change of perspective when we realize the issue isn't suffering, but sovereignty. Now, when he comes to have an understanding of this, I'm struck by Job's willingness to forgive and to pray for his friends at the end. I think that's very important perspective here as well. After his restoration, instead of gloating over them, he prays for them. And that's, I think, very important. Before God restores him, Job has to also engage in forgiveness. And that's a whole topic that's critical. We've talked about forgiveness before, but I believe that that this can be something that can really eat at us. Like a cancer, it can erode us. And there are a lot of people who are wrestling with even, quote, forgiving God for something that they have not really understood. And so they regard him as someone they cannot trust. And ultimately, to forgive is to let loose of our right to supremacy and to the final word, and to understand that God is God, and vengeance is mine, I will repay, and I'm going to leave that in the hands of the living God. I think that's very important. So his willingness to pray for his friends was very, very important. This is just parenthetical. I'm just going to go on a little rabbit trail here. Bick likes my bunny trails anyway. But I mentioned this on Sunday morning when we were coming back from England. The Atlanta airport has this bizarre deal where you have to go through security a second time, which I just never have seen in any other airport on the planet. And as well, they make you check grab your suitcases, and then after you have that privilege, then you put them back so you can collect them again in a brilliant system. However, having said that, I was already bummed out about Richard Reed. You know, the shoe bomber? Because my wife unfortunately gave me an article when we were in England about the guy who was on a hunger strike, and now they're feeding him, force-feeding him intravenously and so forth. And he's whining because he doesn't have certain privileges. You know, complaining about being able to gather and have his, with his Muslim brethren and have prayer. He's looking for privileges. And I every time I have to take my shoes off, I have this feeling of resentment toward this man because of this idiocy here. Hundreds of millions of people are being inconvenienced constantly because of this. And so I already